I'm going to move on to our top story today. Now, pressure's mounting on Chancellor Jeremy Hunt to deliver a voter-friendly budget in the middle of a recession.
Joining us now, Conservative MP, good friend of the show, Tobias Ellwood. Tobias, good morning, my friend. You made it. Thank you very much indeed. Lots to talk about. We'll talk about the terror threat. We'll talk about what's happening. Kamala Harris. Let's start with the budget. To political nerds like Peter Cardwell and you, probably, it's very exciting to us. We're trying to get through the week without falling asleep. He seems to be stuck between the rock and a hard place. I mean, everybody seemingly on the back benches is saying tax cuts, tax cuts. But I said to you last week, and I will stand by this, I think the British people are a bit more switched on than they used to be post-pandemic. And a lot of them are saying to us, if they cut it, it's a short-term measure because we're going to have to pay it back.
Yes, I mean, Margaret Thatcher is often seen as perhaps that the person who introduced tax cuts on the scale that we want to see in Britain. Obviously, this is embedded in the Tory culture, absolutely right. But she only did that when the economy was in a good position. And that isn't the case now, as you've been describing. So absolutely, we want to see tax cuts. When you reduce the tax burden on British business and on our economy, then it allows more enterprise, it allows more investment in our economy, and then we can actually see growth, and that's exactly what we want to see. But if you were to borrow money in order to provide tax cuts, that actually just hands the problem on to a future generation, and that's not the Conservative way of doing things. You're going to hear a lot in the next few days and indeed weeks leading up to the general election. Oh my goodness, it's been 14 years of difficulties. When you hear that, we need to place the context in which the Conservatives have had to run the country. We inherited a pretty appalling situation. Don't forget that letter was left in the Treasury to say there's no money remaining after the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Then, of course, we've had these other big seismic events, which cost money. COVID cost us £400 billion. Now, that means £400 billion that isn't available to be spent on, on our education, on policing, on health and so forth. And then, of course, the war in Ukraine, the impact of the Middle East and so forth. These are global events that are impacting on our economy. And the big question will be, who's best to take us forward through these difficult times? Inflation was rising up at 11% because of a combination of those things I've just mentioned. It's now back down to a more modest position. And that's because of good navigation, taking us into better fiscal place. Clearly more work to be done, but that's the big debate that needs to be had. Who's best placed to take our country forward?
Tobias, when you speak to your constituents, you're the MP for Bournemouth, what are they coming to you with? Are they saying, we want 1p reduction in tax, 2p reduction? Or are they saying, we need improvements to public services?
Yes, it tends to be the latter. It tends to be absolutely greater opportunity for businesses to flourish. Certainly in Bournemouth, it's the issue to do with the tourism tax is coming up. That's been pushed a lot. I very much support that as well. It's also money for local councils too. They want to see that. A lot of pressures on councils at the moment. And they also want to see investment in our defence, something that was just touched on a second ago. We're progressively entering a very dangerous era in our geopolitics, and Britain is normally a country that steps forward. We do need to invest in our defence. There's an awful lot for Jeremy Hunt to consider in the lead up to Wednesday's big budget speech.
So, Tobias, can he afford a 1p tax cut? From what you've been saying, it doesn't sound like there's any room left.
No, it's not for me to make those judgments. We're going to get a full analysis, if you did, like a full stock check of the state of the economy on Wednesday. That's spelled out at the same time to give the appreciation of whether there is fiscal headroom for Jeremy Hunt to make any changes whatsoever and where investment will be made. What I know is that he's absolutely passionate about getting more people back into work. Growing the cake is the best way forward, not borrowing money, which is what other parties would have us do.
Tobias, also, can we move on today? Lots of talk about how the terror level threat in the United Kingdom is now at its heaviest or highest since 9/11. And we were just talking also about this story on the front of the Times. A German Air Force chief reveals UK operations, the secrets in Ukraine. Head of the Luftwaffe sparks alarm in Berlin and London by discussing methods of delivering cruise missiles to Kyiv in an unsecure phone line. Is there a leak? I mean, every day we hear this. This is appalling, man.
Yeah, I mean, lots of questions for Germany to answer now. What on earth were they having such military planning discussions, ignoring normal ComSec protocols? They were not followed. The Russians have picked up on this, and they've leaked it deliberately to cause political discord. It exposes, I'm afraid, the big tensions that exist between the German military that absolutely want to step forward, provide that Taurus missile, which is similar to the Storm Shadow. In other words, to catch up with Britain and what we've done to provide the scale and quality of military assistance that's absolutely needed in Ukraine. And then, of course, the Chancellor that seems to be reluctant to do so. He's behind in the polls. Selling peace is very easy to do in Germany, but it really is for political survival rather than seeing the wider geopolitical picture on the continent of where Putin will go. Putin is now more powerful, make this really clear, than Stalin, and now wants to repeat what Stalin did in expanding his sphere of influence over the east of Europe.
This is what I wanted to say to you, because you weren't here last week, Nick. We were talking about how do you get rid of somebody like Putin? The Russian people, I mean, I thought this was so well described by, I can never remember the guy's name, Edward Lucas maybe. And he said they aren't going to vote him out because what they know is what he tells them. And for people who think that we shouldn't be supporting the Ukraine war, however difficult it is, this actually is Europe's war. And the reason it's Europe's war is if he wins in Ukraine and puts 1 foot outside Ukraine, NATO has to legally do something about it, which is why it is. And also, if you beat Putin inside Ukraine, that sends a very strong message. And that was this guy saying, that's why it is our war, because we have a vested interest about what could happen if he's allowed to march across Europe. And, you know, we've had this discussion, Tobias. People say, oh, come on, Jez, you're warmongering. I think we're in the same position as the late 30s. I don't think we are warmongering. I think we're being honest. I really do.
Well, moving on to yet another conflict now, Tobias. We've been talking this morning about Britain's terror threat being at its highest since 9/11, although I don't believe it's actually officially been increased. Politicians have been told that the war in the Middle East is being used as a recruitment advert by global terror groups. How important do you think it is that we have a show of leadership in the UK, either by the government or by the opposition, to show a real clear stance on what the UK should be doing to influence what's going on in the Middle East? We saw chaos in the Commons recently. There doesn't seem to be a show of leadership, and yet we're being told that this is increasing our threat of terrorism in the UK.
So what we don't see is what's going on behind the scenes. The fact that the United States is now bypassing Prime Minister Netanyahu to drop aid directly into Gaza because we're now moving towards widespread famine shows you how that relationship is breaking down. It shows, I'm afraid, that as I've been saying for some time, that there isn't any clarity as to what the military tactics are, what strategy there is that Israel's pursuing to lead us to a better place, governance and security-wise, for the people of Gaza. And Israel is alienating the very nations that need to and want to step in and support both sides towards a two-state solution once the fighting stops.
But that's the point, isn't it?
Britain.
That's the point, Tobias. When the atrocities happened on October the 7th, from Starmer downwards, everybody rightly said this is absolutely abhorrent. And the whole point was a two-state solution. Within months, Netanyahu says, no, that's not what he wants. We're going to destroy the terrorist cell. They're hiding within the communities, the north to south. They get all of that. This whole thing about ceasefire, I want to ask you about Kamala Harris in a minute. Chris Parry said this morning, it's all well and good for everybody to run around and say ceasefire. The two protagonists in this have no intention, apparently or allegedly. What did you make of Kamala Harris, the world's worst vice president, who hasn't been heard of for about a decade? What did you make of her comments last night?
Well, you cover a lot there. I mean, just on the ceasefire itself, and this is so important, Britain shouting ceasefire from afar won't suddenly conjure up a ceasefire. We all want to work towards a ceasefire, and I support a ceasefire. But with Britain's influence, its soft power and so forth, our connectivity with the region, we need to do more than the obvious call of shouting for a ceasefire and say, what are the steps to get us there? And the first step on the road to a ceasefire, which, by the way, is a contract between both sides, both combatants agreeing a pause for which the details of any form of advance can then be done. It starts with a cessation of hostilities. And time is running out, because Ramadan is fast approaching next week. And to get this organized, I'm afraid that stampede that we saw with people being killed who are so desperate for aid just near the Gaza City showed actually just how tensions are rising inside the Gaza Strip as well. And I simply repeat, if Israel's closest security ally, the United States, is now not talking to Israel to drop aid into the country, then Israel's in a very, very bad place indeed. I'm pleased with what Britain's done. It's absolutely upgraded the scale of support it's trying to get into the country. But there are trucks that are just prevented from getting through into Gaza, and we're going to see the scale of famine, which the world cannot ignore. We're going to have to consider opening up our own lines to get those aid in, those land corridors, those humanitarian corridors in, either by maritime, by sea, or indeed through the Rafah crossing through Egypt as well.
Thank you so much,
unhindered
Tobias
by
Ellwood.
Israel.
Absolutely, it's vitally important.
Tobias, bless you.
Of course, that aid gets through. Thank you, Tobias Ellwood. Well, still